6 is where we'll begin our lesson in just a moment. It's good to see each one here. Thankful that many are recovering, and we pray that the same will be true for everyone else who continues or is picking up the bug as it's going around. But thankful no serious ailments for the most part on that front. I want to talk this morning about a cultural mantra, no regrets. And by that I mean the kind of the attitude that says that, and putting it on t-shirts and hashtags on social media, and maybe posting it on with the background of someone climbing a rock or accomplishing some great task like, getting a face tattoo. No regrets. Live life to the fullest. Do everything that you want to do, and don't look back with any regrets. Now, you might could just take that phrase by itself, and you might think there's something of truth there, something of value there, and that might be so. Just like the mantra, "You only live once." A lot of overlap in those two mantras as they're used in our culture. You only live once is a good thought to keep in mind. And you might keep in mind that you only live once, and therefore you ought to be thoughtful and careful about the decisions you make, and realize that you don't get to go back and do it all over again. And so don't be careless and thoughtless. That's the very opposite of what the world means when they say you only live once. They say you only live once, therefore throw caution to the wind and do terribly irresponsible things because you only get to go around one time. And I think that's very much the same with no regrets. It'd be great if what people meant was be thoughtful about your choices so that you won't regret later. That'd be great. But what they mean is no matter what you do and no matter what you choose to do, never admit any remorse. Don't ever think with sorrow on the decisions you make, but always be prideful and always confident, and never let the consequences get in the way of that pride. I've thought about this phrase for some time. I was watching a movie recently on an airplane, and when I say watching, it was on an airplane. I was giving tangential attention to it, but one of the things that caught my attention in that movie is there was a line where one of the fellows in the movie, he just regurgitates that cultural mantra, no regrets, right? And this older woman, she looks at him like he's the biggest idiot in the world, and he kind of is. And she says, no regrets. It's all regrets. She said, you just spend your whole life running as fast as you can away from the last regret, and you only find out that you're running straight into the next one. And I thought, well, now that's bleak. But it's at least a little bit more honest than the other guy, who was basically saying, let's not be thoughtful about any of our past choices or the consequences of those choices. We get quotes like this: in the end, we only regret the chances we didn't take. It's the only thing we regret. So take all the chances. Live with no excuses. Love with no regret. And of course, that gets plastered onto all sorts of sexual deviancy and degradation. No regrets. There is no time for that. Regret is boring. Live fast, fight hard, no regrets. From that modern sage, John Cena. And so you just see that kind of quote, that kind of attitude being displayed across the board. God does not call us to live with no regrets. He doesn't call on us to abolish regret or to ignore regret. Our goal in life is not a life free from regrets, but one in which we strive to face them and hopefully make them useful. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about this morning. I want to begin here in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 6 in a place that some of your translations will note that God expressed regret. Genesis chapter 6 and beginning in verse 6, it says, the Lord was sorry. And some of your translations there will say regretted The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth. He was grieved in his heart. The Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals, to creeping things, to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made him. So twice here in this context, God says, I regret this. Some of your translations might say, he repented of having made man, which gets to be a difficult concept. How does God repent? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But just at the outset, somebody says, I have no regrets. You go, well, God expressed some regrets, so maybe if God was willing to express some regret, maybe we shouldn't be so pompous as to say we could have a life without regrets. Over in 1 Samuel chapter 15 then, in 1 Samuel chapter 15 and in verse 11, there where Saul has committed a second and more egregious infraction against God's commands, God's response is there in verse 11, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands. And Samuel was distressed and cried out to the Lord all night. Again, down in verse 35, it says, so Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, for Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. And so twice here in this context. Incidentally, the same word as is found back in Genesis chapter 6. In both places, God saying that he regretted having done something. Now, there's a difficulty here right off the bat that I'm sure has jumped off the page already to you. How does God regret? Certainly, how does God repent? How can God be sorry for something? Usually what we think of when we think of regret is something we are responsible for. Well, in a sense, God is responsible, right? He's saying, I'm sorry, or I regret having done this thing. Created man in the case of Genesis 6, having made Saul king here in the case of 1 Samuel 15. There's an additional element of difficulty included in 1 Samuel chapter 15 because in verse 29, as Samuel has delivered this message of judgment to King Saul, and Saul, of course, is pleading. Verse 29, it says, also, the glory of Israel will not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. That word, change his mind, is the word regret. So in the very context where it tells us that God regretted doing this, Samuel says he's not a man that he would regret. Well, obviously, there's some difficulty, some tension to sort of work out there in that context. I think these passages both give us a clue, both the one in Genesis chapter 6 and here in 1 Samuel 15. If you're there in 1 Samuel 15, we'll start there. They give us a clue as to what is meant here as far as God's regret. Again, verse 11, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me, has not carried out my commands. And Samuel was distressed and cried out to the Lord all night. All right, so God regrets, Samuel is distressed or sorrows. Again, down in verse 35, it says, Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made. So here you have the grieving of Samuel, and you have the regret of God. And I think there may be some parallelism. As we turn back to Genesis chapter 6, I think that becomes a more solid theory. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 6. The Lord was sorry, regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So you see that same comparison there. Regret and grieve being set side by side and really kind of used interchangeably. So the idea is this, that God did this, and now it comes to the time where man is sinning, man has become completely sinful, as in Genesis 6, or now has come the time to remove Saul from the throne, and there is grief, there's sorrow over that. Now, in God's case, it's not like most of us. Most of us, if we were in a similar circumstance, maybe we're not guilty, but we still feel some sorrow, we would say something like, if I had known this, I would do things differently. Well, that doesn't apply to God, does it? He's not saying, oh, I just didn't know that this is the way it would turn out. And if I had known that. In fact, I think as you look back, or as you look at the whole of the United Kingdom, you can see Saul's part and even Saul's failure as a part of the story that God is telling, that he raised them up a king just as they had wanted, and he turns out to be the very sort of king that is as shallow and as rebellious as the people themselves have been. And then so in contrast, he raises up David. So it's not that God is saying, well, I just didn't know. I didn't know it would turn out this way. I think he does know. And I think he's still sorrowful. You know, I don't think that changes the fact that God gets to the point where he sees it all play out just as he knew it would play out. And what's the response? I hate it. I hate this. And he hates removing Saul. And he hates bringing the judgment on the whole world. But that doesn't mean that he's wrong. And it doesn't mean that he would go back and uncreate man, or that he would go and not make Saul now that he knows how it turns out. It just simply is the regret, the sorrow that comes along with seeing bad circumstances. And so I would just start with this. As we think about regrets, we think about people saying no regrets. A lot of times what they're saying is, don't be sad over what's past. There's no use in sadness over what's done. What's done is done. It is what it is. There's no use crying over spilled milk. Maybe sometimes there is. Have you seen the price of milk lately? You know, sometimes something happens and people are like, oh, it's done and there's nothing you can do about it. I know, but it's sad. And isn't it appropriate to shed some tears over sad things? I know, maybe there is a sense in which we don't cry over a small thing like spilled milk, but I think that gets applied to very big things. You know, what are you crying over that? I see that as we talk about the degradation of society even. Like Christians, and I think it's a misguided arrogance, an attempt, let me say a misguided attempt at confidence. So you see things continue to progress down a bad path in our culture, in our country, and you mourn that, and you grieve that a little bit. People go, well, there's no use crying over that. What's done is done. I mean, I think it's worth crying over a little bit. I think it's a sad thing, and I think it's worth saying something about. I think it's worth regretting that things are headed down the path that they are. And it's not that it's our fault, and it's not even that we couldn't see it coming. It's just sad when it does get here. We knew it was going to happen. Yeah, and I hate it. And I'm still going to hate it. And when the next thing comes that we know is coming, I'll hate it too. And so, from that standpoint, we ought to not say no regrets, but we ought to be willing to have some regret, some sorrow over sad things happening, over wickedness increasing, whatever it is that is the next shoe to drop, we might say. Well, along similar lines, again, some overlap here, Paul expresses regret in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 8, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with this particular passage. We have the word regret, the New Testament word regret here, twice in the same context. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 8, Paul says, 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 8. Paul writing to them likely about the man that had been discussed in 1 Corinthians 5, now after his repentance. It says, for though I caused you sorrow by my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it. For I see that the letter caused you sorrow, though only for a while. Here is Paul saying, I don't regret, no regrets. I don't regret what I did, but I did regret it. What is he saying? Is he confused? I don't think he is confused. I I think what we find here is both resolve and sorrow, and you can have those two things together. And in fact, I think as we compare this and add this to what we've already said about God and what God did in Genesis 6, what God is doing in 1 Samuel chapter 15, that resolve and sorrow can go side by side and maybe even should often go side by side. It is appropriate in the end to regret even what must be done. I realize we want confidence, and I preach that, I hope, that we should have confidence in doing the right thing. But I also think that we should not be callous about doing the right thing. Tony mentioned in our Bible class this morning about Jeremiah. You see that Jeremiah is constantly struck by the message that he must present to the people. I believe God himself is struck by the message that is brought to the people. He shows them, I love you. I am desperate to save you from all of this, and yet you would not. And Jeremiah takes on that same misery as he is delivering that message. Paul here, he's writing a letter and he knows it's going to hurt. I take no joy in that. I regret the hurt, but I don't, in so much as it produces good things. Look, how many times have we regretted hurt? Have we regretted having to do something, but we know it must be done, and we are hopeful about the result that it will produce? That's not an uncommon thing. In fact, it ought to be very common. And in fact, if it is not common, then maybe we are not, we don't have the kindness or the compassion that we ought to have that ought to be added to our resolve. A father one time was talking to me about his kids. I was a teenager, and maybe in my early, maybe around 20. I wasn't married yet, and obviously didn't have kids. And he was, I was helping him do some work, and one of his kids came down there and was misbehaving, and he took the kid up and gave him some spanking and sent him on his way. And afterwards he said, you know, growing up, my dad said to me on occasion, this is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. And he said, I just want to tell you, as a father, I don't get that at all. I guarantee you it hurts him more than it hurts me. And he chuckled. And I thought it was pretty funny. I didn't have any kids. And I thought, that's probably right. I mean, I know the spankings hurt me pretty hard, and I don't know how much they hurt my dad, but I know how much they hurt me. I think that man didn't understand the nature of discipline. I think if it's not hurting you in some way, that's a problem. You're not administering that like the Father. That if you are callous, if you are able to go and inflict pain and it does nothing to you, God himself doesn't act that way. And the Apostle Paul doesn't act that way. He says, I have no desire to bring pain. I will, and I'll do it. And God says I'll do it. And I'll do it as often as I have to, but I never want to. And so we should never savor something like that. It is okay to know that you're doing the right thing and not love the process. In fact, again, as I say, that ought to be the case. Well, so here's like a baseline criticism. We're not even talking about when you do wrong things and what regrets you ought to have there. We're talking, even when you're doing the right thing, you ought to experience the emotion of regret. And so that's not even to mention when you actually do make mistakes and when you do commit sins, that there ought to be regret. So with that in mind, I want to think about how we deal with our regrets. We don't want to ignore them. We want to recognize them. Let me just say that's really ultimately when somebody says no regrets in the way that the world means that, what they mean is I'm going to pretend that regret doesn't exist. It's there, I guarantee you. And that's what they're trying to preach to themselves. Just ignore it, pretend it's not there, act like you don't regret, like you're not sorry. And all they're doing is sort of storing that up for a day of reckoning. We need to understand and define our regret. Is it simply like we've already been talking about, something that is sad, but it's still a good decision. Well, it's okay to feel that, but don't let that dampen your resolve. And understand and make the distinction between what you're sad about. Like Paul is doing in 2 Corinthians. That's what he's doing. He's separating out and saying, I have regret over this, but not over this. Right? And there's a distinction to be made. We have to do that with our children. I'm sad about this. I'm not sad about this. Right? I'm still resolved about this. And don't confuse the two. Is it something that we regret, but we could only have known in hindsight? This is an element of regret that God doesn't experience, but we as humans do. We make decisions based on the information that we have available at the moment. And then later on, maybe more information becomes available because we're finite and we can't see the future. And so we look back and we say, I didn't know. But can I suggest to you that even that, there needs to be some level of recognition of regret and responsibility? When we look at the law, we look at what the law has to say about the man who's chopping wood and the axe handle flies off and it hits someone else, and he is not guilty of murder in that case. Somebody might say, I didn't know that the axe head was loose. All right, and along with that, God brings in a law about an ox that gores, and he says, you got an ox and you don't know it gores people, and it goes and it kills somebody. And that's different than you got an ox and you know that it gores people and you didn't do anything about it. You'll be guilty then. But over here, you didn't know, so you're not guilty. But there's still payment to be rendered. You see, there's still consequence. And I think sometimes we want to run so far. We're so self-justifying that when something happens and we couldn't have known, and because we couldn't have known, we say that consequences shouldn't even be considered because my intentions were good. We've got a whole world of that. I've been, as people are reviewing the decisions of the last couple of years over pandemic decisions and information that is coming out now more and more, and it's helping us to look back and evaluate the efficacy of some of those decisions. I saw someone the other day that said, I will never regret this decision, no matter what, because I did it with good motives, even if it caused harm to people. And I thought, you could say, I did the best I could with the knowledge that I had. But in hindsight, I wish we had done something different. But you cannot, because that would be taking on even an ounce of responsibility, and I cannot. I must maintain my innocence at all costs. We got to be careful about that. Just because you say that a decision, that in hindsight a decision could have been better, doesn't mean you're saying I had terrible motives, and you're not taking on all the guilt of murder or even manslaughter. But there should be some ability to look back and evaluate the consequences, and maybe even my participation in them, as innocent as it may have been, and still just recognize it and feel some regret there. And then, of course, it could be something that we could have done better. And we knew, and we could have known to do better. But even then, it might not be sin. In other words, there are times where we look back and we could say, I could have handled that better. I'm not saying that I sinned, but I certainly, there were better ways to have gone about this. Maybe in a conversation or something, maybe tone or things like that. And again, a lot of times people are they got to hold on to maintain innocence so hard that they can't even admit that. And maybe part of that's because there are situations where if we admit some degree of, yes, I regret this element and I could have done better, then somebody over here is going to pounce on that, aha. And of course, it's disastrous in both directions. But we ought to be people who are able to look back and just say, yeah, I could have done that better. And I'm going to try to think about that and be thoughtful about that in the future. Then, of course, there's sin, which we obviously ought to regret and we ought to learn from. So there are categories. There are regrets that simply must be borne. There is nothing we can do about it but sorrow. But we could do that. We don't want to be dragged down into a pit that we cannot escape from. But to make time for sorrow is appropriate. That's not a useless regret. And in fact, we hope we don't grow so callous that we don't feel those regrets any longer. But then there are regrets that teach. And I think really that's all the other categories. This other category that simply must be born, it's not necessarily that we even have to learn a lesson from that. I don't think that, when God made Saul king and saw how it turned out, he goes, well, I've really learned my lesson now. I think he just is sorrowing. And that's going to happen. But really every other regret ought to teach us something. Even so, for instance, and let's look at Luke chapter 10. To be able to look back and see where improvement could be made, whether it is sinful and therefore obviously improvement ought to be made, or simply that we admit that what we did was not the best. To find that room for regret without necessarily condemning everything that you ever did. Isn't that what people do to avoid regret sometimes? You try to point out some fault. You say, hey, look, I think you could really work on this. Oh, so I guess I'm just the worst dad that ever lived, am I? Okay, we can't have a conversation. You see, if you can't look and say, here's the thing I regret. That doesn't mean everything, but I do regret this. Wish I'd have done that better. You see, then you can grow and you can learn. In Luke chapter 10 and verse 38, we have that familiar story of Mary and Martha. Now, as they were traveling along, Jesus, entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. And she had a sister called Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations, and she came up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister's left me to do all the serving alone? Then tell her to help me. But the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you're worried and bothered about so many things, but only one thing is necessary. For Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. And think about Martha thinking back on this occasion. And the different ways she could sort of process that. Now, obviously, if you're in those shoes, you've got to feel like not great that you got the rebuke. You were hoping to give the rebuke or maybe at least encourage the Lord to give the rebuke, and then it got turned around on you, and you're the one who's red-faced. And you're thinking back on that, and you can think, ultimately, what Mary did was more beneficial to her. And I could have been taking the time to sit down and glean from the Son of God in our home. And I got distracted by less important things. Or she could look back and go, I didn't do anything wrong. Somebody's got to make these preparations. And he's going to come on me like that? When what I was doing was actually something that a woman of the home ought to be doing? How dare he? No regrets. She could refuse to have any regrets because she could find a way to justify what she did. And I think that's what we do when we live lives of no regrets. We figure out ways of saying, what I did was not technically wrong. In fact, maybe what I did was right. And you're going to sit here and judge me for my decision. What about you? And we turn it around and we deflect. And we don't learn anything. And we keep perpetuating the same sorts of things. And we guarantee that we will continue to have those regrets. Our children will continue to have those regrets. I want I want my children to be better parents than I have been. And by that, I don't mean that I think I've been a terrible parent. I just mean that I know I've made mistakes, and I hope that not only can I admit them, but I can admit them in a way that they can learn from them, and they don't have to go repeating them. Now, I know you're probably going to say, well, they're going to have to, some of them. Yeah, I know, but I'm trying to reduce. Could we reduce regret? Maybe make it a little bit less for the next generation? Or must we hold on to the notion that we got to a point where I figured it out, I have been the best parent ever, and you cannot improve on what I have done. And if you come along saying you're going to do something differently, I must take that as an indictment of everything that I've ever done. No. We went to listen. I tell you what put this thought in my mind. We went to listen to Scott Smeltzer doing some lessons on the home a few years back. And he had some just excellent advice and thoughtful things about how you interact with your children, especially as they're growing up. And I was standing in the back with one of the elders. And I said, you know, he does a really good job. And he said, he certainly does. And I said, I just wish I could go convince my 22-year-old self of some of these things. I could just go back and have a conversation and say, listen, there are things that you think are not important that are very important, and there are things that you think are vital that you will not care about in just a few years. Just kind of have an adjustment with myself. And he said, I think my kids turned out pretty good. And I was like, well, I mean, I wasn't accusing you of anything else, but I mean, I think my kids are pretty good. I think it could have done better. And when I hear somebody talking about the ideal, I see lots of places where I wasn't there, and I kind of wish I had been. I really wish I had been. And I think things would be better for me, and I think things would be better for my children if I had been more careful and thoughtful. And so I hope that my kids were listening, and I tried to make sure that they were listening so that when they have children, they will know those things sooner. Here's a man, I guess he sat there all week and thought, well, that's not what I did, but what I did was fine. Learn nothing. I want the next generation to learn. I want them to learn from my mistakes. I want them to be able to grow from what I pass on. There is, though, as we come to a close from this lesson, the kind of regret that removes regret. If we're being instructed, if we're taking things the way that we ought to. Coming back to 2 Corinthians chapter 7. 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 10. For the sorrow that is according to the will of God produces a repentance without regret, leading to salvation. But the sorrow of the world produces death. And then he goes on to talk about that godly sorrow and what it produces, how it gets from sorrow to salvation. Behold, what earnestness this very thing, what godly sorrow has produced in you. What vindication of yourselves, what indignation, what fear, what longing, what zeal, what avenging of wrong, and everything you demonstrated yourselves to be innocent in the matter. The thought that one of the problems we look at regret is we have those extremes. No regrets, it's all regrets. Here, Paul is saying, use it. Do something. Be motivated by it. Think in terms of, I don't want to feel this way again. I don't want to go down this path again. And so let it energize. Look at the energy of the language that he's using there in verse 11. Look at the zeal he talks about. Vindication of yourselves. Avenging of wrong. You really took it to heart. And so you remove regret, and you remove it in two directions. You remove the regret going backwards because you bring it to God. You remove the regret going forwards because you change your behavior and you don't have to go down this road again. So you're not piling on regrets. And so you've reduced it. You're going to have fewer regrets, none looking backwards, fewer at least looking forwards. Then, of course, there's the kind of regret that only builds. He talks about that being the sorrow of this world there in verse 10 that produces death. Romans chapter 7, I think that's the sort of regret that Paul describes there. As a man under the law and as a man who's under the law with, I think, an improper understanding of his relationship to God. He begins in verse 14, we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of flesh, sold into bondage to sin. What I am doing, I do not understand. For I am not practicing what I would like to do, but I am doing the very thing I hate. But if I do the very thing I do not want to do, I agree with the law, confessing that the law is good. So now, no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For the willing is present in me, but the doing of the good is not. For the good that I want to do, I do not do. But I practice the very evil that I want to do. But if I am doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. I find in the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. For I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man, but I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin which is in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from this body of death? That's it. It spirals down. It goes to death. It's wallowing in the regret. When we are made aware of failure, when we see it ourselves, it's pointed out to us by someone, we recognize it because we see it in our children, what do? Do you allow that to produce some energy that says, I am going to get out of this? And you cling to the Lord who will lead you there? Or do you say, nothing's going to change? I want to be better, but I'm not. I'm going to be stuck in this pit. I'm going to be stuck in this hole, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. And I think that's really, well, there's two ways that the devil handles that. No regrets. Just ignore it. Defend, self-justify, or just be swallowed up with misery. He's fine either way. He doesn't care which path you take. Arrogance or despair. He gets what he wants. But the other path is not despair, but it is humility. It is one in which God does not say, have no regrets, but let your regrets drive you to me. No regrets is a path of a self-deluded, cowardly, prideful sinner. We are to stand with courage, humility, and clarity of the child of God. We stare directly at our regrets and sorrows of the past, of this past year, of our past lives. We learn the lessons that are available. We restore what is possible to restore, and we pass on what knowledge can be passed on. We grieve what ought to be grieved, but then we set them down at the feet of the one who has promised to take them away. The answer to no regrets is not a life full of them. It is a life with an answer to them. If you need an answer to your regrets, there's only one that satisfies. And if you give your life over to him this morning, if there's any way that we can assist you with that, won't you come forward while we stand and while we sing?